If a man can humiliate his own wife in front of 50 guests, what else is he capable of? The words were never spoken aloud, yet they seemed to echo beneath the vaulted ceiling of Hawthorne Hall as Marquis Adrian Hawthorne's voice cut cleanly through the music. You will never be my true wife. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, their candlelight reflecting against 20-foot windows rimmed with winter frost, while silk skirts stilled and gloved hands froze midair. At the center of it all stood Marchioness Elena Whitmore, her spine straight, her expression composed, her fingers resting lightly on the leather-bound estate ledger she carried as if it were nothing more than a dinner invitation. She did not flinch. She did not argue. And somehow, that silence unsettled the room more than any protest could have. Adrian felt it too, though he refused to name it. Pride stiffened his shoulders as murmurs rippled across polished marble floors. The Hawthorne name had stood for 3 generations. Dignity, control, order. He would not allow whispers to suggest weakness within his own household. Yet when Elena inclined her head, just once, in a gesture so graceful it might have been mistaken for obedience, and turned toward the great doors, something unfamiliar stirred beneath his ribs. Outside, the January wind swept across the 50-acre estate, driving snow against the stone facade in restless spirals. Footmen hurried to open the doors, but Elena stepped forward before they could shield her, the cold air rushing in around her like a warning. She walked down the wide granite steps alone, her ivory gown disappearing into the white horizon beyond the carriage path. No tears, no plea. Inside the hall, Count Lucas Ashford watched from the far archway, his steady gaze following her retreat. He said nothing, yet his silence carried a different weight, one of respect rather than dismissal. Adrian noticed. Of course he did, and the awareness burned sharper than the winter wind. An hour later, while guests forced brittle laughter back into the air, Adrian found himself staring at the abandoned ledger she had set down on a console table before leaving. He had never seen her carry it before. He had never thought to ask why she spent afternoons in the estate office reviewing figures that were technically beneath her concern. His hand hovered over the leather cover before he withdrew it, unwilling to admit curiosity. Across the frozen fields, a tenant family's chimney had stopped smoking 3 days ago. Elena knew that. Adrian did not. And as snow continued to fall in steady, relentless inches, covering carriage tracks and footprints alike, the Marquis felt, for the first time in 7 years of calculated distance, that something in his perfectly ordered world had shifted. He had meant to wound her pride. Instead, he had unknowingly set in motion a choice that would test his own. Because while Hawthorne Hall glittered in candlelight, Elena Whitmore was already walking into the storm. Not to prove she was his true wife, but to prove she never needed his permission to become one. By the time the last carriage rolled away from Hawthorne Hall, the storm had swallowed every trace of Elena's footsteps, but it had not erased the unease settling beneath Adrian Hawthorne's ribs. He stood alone in his study, the fire snapping softly in the 12-foot hearth, shadows moving across the portraits of ancestors who had built their fortune acre by acre. Control had always been his inheritance. Emotion had never been permitted to interfere with legacy. Yet the ledger she left behind rested on his desk like a quiet accusation. He told himself he opened it out of responsibility, nothing more. The columns were neat, the ink steady, every expense accounted for in her precise hand. Coal shipments reduced, medical supplies purchased, notes in the margins regarding families on the eastern boundary whose livestock had not survived the early frost. Adrian frowned. He had not authorized additional distributions. He had not even been informed. And yet there, in careful script, Elena had documented a decline in reserves that could jeopardize spring planting, if not corrected. She had not been idle in her silence. She had been watching. Outside, the wind drove snow in relentless sheets across the 50 acres of winter fields, piling high against stone fences and barn doors. Miles from the warmth of the hall, a small tenant cottage stood without smoke rising from its chimney. Elena reached it just after dusk, her boots heavy with snow, her gloved hands raw from the cold despite the wool lining. She did not knock loudly. She did not wish to startle them. When the door opened, warm breath and worry met her in equal measure. The mother inside looked stunned to see the Marchioness standing on her narrow porch with a lantern in one hand and a folded packet of documents in the other. Elena stepped inside without ceremony. The room measured barely 10 feet across, the single stove nearly empty of fuel. She removed her cloak and immediately knelt beside a young boy wrapped in blankets too thin for January. Her voice remained calm, steady, unhurried as she explained that the arrears on their lease had been forgiven, that feed for the remaining livestock would arrive by morning, that a physician from town would be paid in full for the child's cough. She did not mention the heirloom bracelet now missing from her wrist. She did not mention the count who had offered assistance when she sought credit in town. She simply worked, stacking wood, writing instructions, promising what she fully intended to deliver. Back at Hawthorne Hall, Adrian closed the ledger slowly. Snow struck the tall windows in soft, insistent waves. For 7 years he had believed distance was discipline, that withholding warmth would protect them both from disappointment. Yet as he read her notes detailing shortages he had overlooked and sacrifices she had quietly made, an unfamiliar realization pressed against his pride. While he guarded the reputation of his name, she had been guarding the lives attached to it. And somewhere beyond the frozen fields, beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds, the woman he had dismissed as ornamental was carrying his legacy in ways he had never bothered to see. The storm did not ease by morning. Snow had risen nearly 18 inches along the eastern fence line, and the wind pressed against Hawthorne Hall as though determined to test the strength of its stone walls. Adrian Hawthorne had not slept. The ledger remained open across his desk, candlelight tracing the steady slope of Elena's handwriting, each note a quiet testament to attention he had never offered. Shortly after dawn, a knock sounded at his study door. It was not his steward. It was not a servant. It was Count Lucas Ashford, his dark coat dusted in white, boots marked with the same winter road that led past the tenant cottages. Adrian did not invite him to sit. Lucas removed his gloves with measured calm. He did not smile. He did not provoke. He simply placed a folded receipt upon the desk. The sum listed was modest by noble standards, yet significant for a single household. In January, coal, feed, physician's travel. Adrian recognized the handwriting authorizing payment. It was Elena's. Lucas spoke evenly, explaining that the Marchioness had come into town the previous evening seeking immediate credit against personal jewelry. She had not asked for help. She had asked for time. When merchants hesitated, Lucas had extended his own line of trust, not as charity, but as acknowledgement of responsibility. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. Pride urged him to dismiss the gesture. Reason refused. Lucas did not linger. Before leaving, he added only one sentence. Your wife understands the weight of your name more than you realize. The study door closed softly. Silence expanded. Adrian stood at the window, overlooking 50 acres of white fields, the frozen lake beyond reflecting a pale gray sky. For years he had believed discipline required distance. He had convinced himself that withholding warmth preserved order. Yet somewhere in the night, Elena had walked miles through knee-deep snow to preserve something far more fragile than reputation. She had preserved loyalty. He summoned the steward at once. Questions followed. Why had shortages gone unreported? Why had the eastern cottages fallen behind on fuel? The answers were hesitant, wrapped in assumptions that winter losses were expected and that such matters rarely required the Marquis' personal attention. Adrian dismissed him with a single nod. He felt no need to raise his voice. Disappointment required no volume. By midday, supply wagons were being loaded in the courtyard. 40-pound sacks of feed, stacks of split wood, medical provisions carefully wrapped in canvas. Orders were issued with precise clarity, not from obligation, from recognition. Yet even as action replaced complacency, one realization lingered heavier than snow against the roof. Elena had not informed him of her plans. She had not sought approval. She had acted because it was necessary, not because it would earn his notice. And that truth unsettled him more than any public defiance ever could. Somewhere beyond the frost-lined hedges, she was still in the eastern fields, her white cloak moving against the winter horizon. Adrian remained at the window longer than he intended, watching the road where she would eventually return. For the first time since their marriage, he understood that authority without understanding was not strength. It was blindness. And blindness, he was beginning to see, had cost him far more than he had ever been willing to admit. Elena did not return to Hawthorne Hall until late afternoon, when the storm had softened into a pale drift that coated the 50 acres in a deceptive stillness. Her cloak was lined with frost, the hem heavy from hours in the fields, yet her posture remained unbroken as she stepped through the great doors. Servants moved aside quietly, uncertain whether to greet her with courtesy or curiosity. News traveled swiftly in houses built of stone and whispers. She removed her gloves with deliberate care, revealing faint redness along her fingers, and handed her lantern to the nearest footman as though she had only taken a brief walk in the garden. Adrian stood at the far end of the entrance hall, near the wide staircase that curved beneath a stained glass window. He had intended to remain in his study, to consider his words before speaking, yet something stronger than pride had drawn him there. For a moment neither of them moved. The space between them felt larger than the 30 feet of polished marble that separated their steps. He noticed what others would not: the absence of her bracelet, the fine tremor in her shoulders that she concealed by clasping her hands together, the faint scent of smoke and winter air clinging to her wool. "You have been away since last night," he said at last, his voice measured but no longer sharp. Elena inclined her head slightly. The eastern cottages required attention. "They have it now." She did not elaborate. She did not defend herself. That restraint unsettled him more than confrontation would have. "I have ordered additional supplies delivered," Adrian continued. "Coal, feed, medical assistance. The shipments left at noon." A flicker of surprise crossed her expression, subtle but undeniable. "Thank you," she replied softly. There was no triumph in her tone, no satisfaction, only acknowledgement. Silence followed, heavier than before. Outside, the wind brushed against the tall windows in long, steady sighs. Adrian took a step forward, closing a fraction of the distance. "You sold your jewelry," he said quietly, not as accusation but as realization. Elena met his gaze then, her gray eyes steady. "It was an exchange, not a loss. Metal for warmth, ornament for survival. The estate will recover by spring." He felt the simplicity of her logic press against his carefully constructed authority. For years he had believed leadership required detachment. Yet here stood the woman he had dismissed as ceremonial, speaking of 50 acres of frozen ground as though it were a living responsibility. "You should have informed me," he said, though the words lacked their former command. Elena's expression did not harden. "I did not wish to trouble you during your gathering." The memory of candlelight and polished laughter returned to him with uncomfortable clarity. She had walked into a blizzard while he entertained admiration. A quiet understanding settled between them, fragile and unspoken. Adrian became aware that the distance he had preserved so diligently now felt less like protection and more like absence. "You will not walk alone again," he said finally, the statement carrying less authority and more promise than he expected. Elena did not immediately respond. Instead, she regarded him with thoughtful stillness, as though measuring sincerity rather than sound. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft, relentless inches, covering the old tracks in the courtyard. Inside, something equally silent began to shift, not with force, not with drama, but with the steady recognition that a legacy could not be sustained by pride alone. And for the first time since their marriage began, the air between them no longer felt entirely frozen. The following morning dawned with a fragile brightness, sunlight spilling across the snow-covered 50 acres as though the storm had never existed. Hawthorne Hall stood quiet beneath the pale sky, its tall stone facade softened by light that glinted against icicles hanging from the roofline. Inside, however, calm did not mean stillness. Word had traveled overnight. The eastern cottages had been supplied. The Marchioness had intervened. The Marquis had issued orders without delay. Servants moved with renewed precision, aware that something subtle had shifted within the walls. Elena sat at a long oak table in the estate office, sleeves rolled slightly above her wrists, reviewing updated accounts with steady concentration. The absence of her bracelet was noticeable in the morning light, yet she gave it no attention. Columns of numbers filled the page before her, projections for spring planting, adjustments for winter loss, notes regarding soil recovery once frost released its hold. She did not hear Adrian enter at first. He paused near the doorway, observing in silence. For years he had seen this room as administrative necessity, a place beneath the dignity of his direct involvement. Now he saw her there, seated beneath tall windows that framed endless white fields, and understood that stewardship was not beneath anyone who valued legacy. "You rise early," he said, not sharply, not formally. Elena looked up, calm as ever. "The ground does not wait for convenience," she replied. "When thaw comes, we must be prepared." He stepped closer, noticing ink smudged faintly along her fingertip. "You have recalculated the winter deficit." She nodded. "If we reduce decorative expenditures this quarter and divert resources towards seed investment, we will recover by harvest. It will require discipline." He almost smiled at that word. Discipline had been his shield. She spoke it as commitment rather than control. Outside, wagon wheels moved across packed snow as additional supplies departed for distant barns. Adrian glanced toward the window, then back at her. "I have asked the steward to report directly to both of us from now on," he said quietly. Elena's gaze lingered on him, measuring intent. "Both of us." The phrase felt new within these walls. "It is your estate," she answered carefully. "It is our responsibility," he corrected, the words leaving him before pride could restrain them. Silence followed, but it did not wound. It settled like fresh snow, soft yet transformative. For 7 years they had occupied the same halls like strangers honoring a contract. Now, seated across from one another at a table scattered with figures and futures, something steadier began to form. Not passion, not yet forgiveness, but recognition. Adrian reached for the ledger she had once carried alone into the storm and placed his hand beside hers on the page. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet neither withdrew immediately. The winter sun climbed higher, casting long beams across polished wood and careful ink. Outside, the fields waited for spring. Inside, beneath the quiet authority of shared purpose, the first true partnership of their marriage began to take root. By the end of the week, the snow had settled into a hardened crust across the 50 acres, sunlight glinting against the fields in sharp silver flashes that promised eventual thaw. Inside Hawthorne Hall, routine resumed with a subtle but unmistakable difference. Reports arrived at the estate office each morning, not to a single desk, but to 2 chairs placed side by side at the long oak table. Elena reviewed them with quiet precision, her pen moving steadily across margins, while Adrian listened more. Then he spoke, asking fewer commands and more questions. The staff noticed. Servants who once approached her with cautious formality now did so with open respect. The steward delivered updates directly to both, his tone carefully balanced. Change did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived in small acknowledgments. On the 4th afternoon after the storm, a carriage appeared at the main gates bearing a familiar crest. Count Lucas Ashford stepped down onto the cleared stone drive, winter light catching the dark wool of his coat. His visit was neither scandalous nor secret. It was official. Grain prices had shifted in the county market, and cooperative purchasing would secure better rates for both estates. Elena received him in the east drawing room, sunlight spilling through tall windows and illuminating the pale blue silk of her gown. Adrian joined them moments later, his posture measured but no longer distant. Conversation remained professional. Figures were exchanged. Contracts discussed. Yet beneath the civility lingered something less quantifiable. Adrian observed the way Lucas addressed Elena directly, not as ornament, but as authority. He noted the ease with which she responded, her voice clear, her knowledge precise. It unsettled him in a way pride could not disguise. Not because he feared impropriety, but because he recognized how easily respect had been offered by another man when he himself had withheld it. After the count departed, promising delivery of seed by early March, silence filled the room once more. Elena moved toward the window, watching the carriage disappear beyond the wrought iron gates. Adrian remained behind her, aware of the distance that once defined them and of the choice now presented. "You handled negotiations well," he said at last. She turned slightly, surprised not by the compliment but by its sincerity. "It is easier to negotiate when both parties seek mutual gain," she replied softly. He understood the implication. Marriage had not always reflected that principle. A pause lingered, heavy yet not hostile. Outside, workers began clearing the north field in preparation for thaw, their movements steady against the white horizon. Adrian stepped closer, close enough to notice the faint flush on her cheeks from the warmth of the room. "I have underestimated you," he admitted quietly. The words cost him little in volume and much in pride. Elena regarded him with thoughtful calm. "You did not see me," she answered, not accusing, merely stating fact. The honesty struck deeper than reproach. For years he had guarded legacy as though it were fragile glass. Yet it had been her steady hands that carried it through the storm. As afternoon light shifted across polished floors and framed portraits of stern ancestors, Adrian felt the last remnants of distance begin to loosen. Not broken, not erased, but softened by awareness. Outside, the fields awaited planting. Inside, beneath winter's sun and silent acknowledgement, something more enduring than authority began to grow. The following week brought a brittle thaw, sunlight melting the top layer of snow until the fields glistened like sheets of glass across the 50 acres. Hawthorne Hall prepared for its first formal dinner since the storm, a modest gathering by noble standards, yet significant enough to draw neighboring families and merchants eager to observe any shift within its walls. Candles were lit along the grand staircase, silver-polished until it reflected every flicker of flame, and the long dining table stretched nearly 20 feet beneath crystal light. Elena descended the staircase with quiet composure, wearing a deep blue gown that echoed the winter sky just before dusk. There was nothing ostentatious in her appearance, yet the absence of ornament only sharpened her presence. Conversations softened as she entered the room. Adrian watched from the far end of the hall, noting the subtle change in how guests inclined their heads toward her, not out of obligation, but recognition. The eastern cottages had spoken. Supplies had arrived. Word of decisive action had traveled farther than rumor ever could. As the evening progressed, laughter rose in measured waves. Wine glasses chimed gently against porcelain, and polite discussion of crop forecasts replaced earlier speculation. Yet beneath the civility lingered undercurrents. A merchant's wife remarked lightly upon the Marchioness's recent efforts in town. Another guest praised the swift coordination between Hawthorne and Ashford estates. The mention of Count Lucas's name drifted across the table like a deliberate test. Adrian felt it. He remained composed, though the awareness settled firmly within his chest. Elena responded with grace, crediting cooperation rather than individual generosity. She did not embellish. She did not deny. Her voice carried steady authority without invitation for scandal. After dinner, guests gathered near the tall windows overlooking fields that now reflected moonlight in pale silver sheets. Music began softly from a quartet positioned near the fireplace. Couples stepped onto the polished floor. Adrian hesitated only briefly before crossing the distance between himself and his wife. "May I have this dance?" he asked, not as command but request. A hush seemed to follow the words, subtle yet undeniable. Elena met his gaze, searching not for performance but sincerity. Then she placed her gloved hand in his. The dance was not elaborate. It was measured, restrained, yet undeniably public. As they moved beneath the glow of candlelight, Adrian felt the weight of every unspoken year between them. He noticed the steadiness of her breath, the calm in her posture, the way she did not cling nor withdraw. Around them, whispers shifted tone. Not speculation. Recognition. Outside, moonlight stretched across thawing acres, illuminating the promise of spring beneath frozen ground. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers and watchful eyes, Adrian understood that authority was not diminished by partnership. It was strengthened by it. As the music slowed, he held her gaze a moment longer than etiquette required. Not to display possession, not to quiet rumor, but because for the first time, he wished the world to see what he had finally begun to understand. And in that silent acknowledgement, the distance that once defined them gave way to something steadier, something chosen rather than imposed. Morning arrived with a restless wind that swept across the thawing 50 acres, carrying with it the faint scent of turned earth beneath melting frost. Hawthorne Hall stirred earlier than usual, servants moving through corridors with purposeful urgency. Word had reached the estate before sunrise. A merchant from the southern road had refused delivery to one of the eastern tenant families, claiming the Marchioness had authorized excessive extensions of credit beyond the estate's capacity. The accusation traveled quickly, gathering weight with each retelling. Elena stood at the long oak table in the estate office once more, the ledger open before her, sunlight cutting across its pages in pale stripes. Her expression remained composed, but a quiet tension settled in her shoulders. Adrian entered without announcement, already aware of the rumor. He had heard it from the steward, whose tone carried the careful neutrality of a man unwilling to choose sides too soon. "The merchant insists that your generosity risks destabilizing accounts," Adrian said evenly, watching her reaction. Elena did not lift her gaze immediately. "I extended credit only within projected recovery margins," she replied. "Every entry is documented." He moved closer, scanning the columns. The figures were precise, conservative even. There was no recklessness in her calculations, only foresight. Outside the tall windows, workers prepared soil in narrow strips where frost had retreated, hopeful signs of spring pressing against lingering winter. Yet inside, doubt moved more stubbornly than cold. "The merchant has requested a formal review before the county council," Adrian continued. "It will be public." Elena's fingers paused over the page. Public scrutiny was not unfamiliar to her, yet this carried different weight. It would question not her charity, but her competence. "I will attend," she said quietly. Adrian studied her profile, the calm line of her jaw, the absence of fear in her eyes. For 7 years he had stood between her and the world, but rarely beside her. That distinction now mattered. "You will not stand alone before them," he said. She turned then, meeting his gaze fully. "I do not require protection," she answered with gentle firmness. "I require fairness." The word struck him with unexpected clarity. Protection implied weakness. Partnership implied respect. "Very well," he replied after a measured pause. "Then we will seek fairness together." Later that afternoon, as preparations were made for the council gathering in the neighboring town 10 miles south, Adrian reviewed the accounts himself. Not as overseer, as witness. Each entry reflected restraint. Each projection aligned with realistic yield once planting began. There was no extravagance, no vanity, only responsibility. In the courtyard, Elena prepared to depart, adjusting her gloves against the lingering chill. The air carried the promise of rain rather than snow. Adrian joined her beside the carriage, the distance between them no longer defined by silence, but by shared intent. "Rumor may travel quickly," he said quietly, "but truth endures longer." Elena offered a faint, thoughtful smile. "Then let us ensure it is heard clearly." The carriage wheels began to turn across gravel still damp from thaw. Behind them, Hawthorne Hall stood tall against a shifting sky. Ahead, scrutiny awaited. Yet for the first time since their marriage began, they moved toward it not as separate figures bound by title, but as partners bound by choice. The carriage ride to the county hall took nearly an hour across damp country roads, the wheels cutting through softened earth as clouds gathered low and heavy above the horizon. 10 miles south of Hawthorne Hall, the council chambers stood in a square brick building that smelled faintly of polished wood and old parchment. Merchants, landowners, and council members had already assembled when Elena and Adrian entered, their footsteps echoing against the wide plank floors. Conversations paused, not dramatically, but with careful attention. The merchant who had raised the complaint stood near the long central table, papers clutched in his hands as though numbers alone might justify doubt. Elena felt the weight of every gaze upon her, yet her posture remained steady. She did not seek Adrian's hand, nor did she step behind him. She walked beside him. The chairman cleared his throat and invited explanation. The merchant spoke first, outlining concerns about overextended credit, suggesting that generosity without restraint threatened the stability of the Hawthorne estate and, by extension, the regional economy. His tone was polite, yet edged with implication. Elena listened without interruption. When invited to respond, she moved forward, placing the ledger upon the table with quiet certainty. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber. Each extension of credit was calculated against projected spring yield, she explained. She detailed soil assessments conducted after early frost, outlined cost reductions in non-essential expenditures, and demonstrated that seed investments secured through cooperative purchasing would offset winter losses by midsummer. The council members leaned closer as she turned the pages, revealing margins filled with precise figures. There was no excess, no sentiment masquerading as strategy, only careful foresight. Questions followed, measured and direct. She answered each one without hesitation. Adrian observed from her side, aware that this was not defense but demonstration. At one point, The merchant attempted to suggest that her authority exceeded appropriate bounds for a Marchioness. The implication lingered in the air like a thin veil. Before Elena could respond, Adrian spoke, his voice calm, yet unmistakably firm. The Marchioness acts with my full confidence and authority, he stated. Every decision reflected in that ledger represents not indulgence, but stewardship. The silence that followed was not tense. It was decisive. The chairman nodded slowly, acknowledging the clarity of evidence before him. After brief deliberation, the council affirmed that no instability threatened the Hawthorne estate. On the contrary, the measures taken demonstrated responsible governance during seasonal hardship. The merchant inclined his head in reluctant acceptance. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the tall windows, washing dust from the panes and darkening the earth beyond. As the chamber emptied, Elena closed the ledger gently, her fingers brushing its worn edges. Adrian looked at her not with surprise, but with recognition. You were prepared, he said quietly. I always am, she replied, not with pride but truth. They stepped back into the rain, the scent of wet soil rising from the ground. For the first time since their marriage began, scrutiny had not divided them. It had revealed them. And as the carriage carried them back across 10 miles of glistening road toward 50 acres awaiting spring, Adrian understood that respect, once earned, reshapes more than reputation. It reshapes the heart. Rain followed them all the way back to Hawthorne Hall, a steady silver curtain that blurred the 50 acres into soft impressionist strokes of brown earth and melting white. By the time the carriage wheels rolled beneath the arched stone entrance, twilight had begun to settle, turning the tall windows into mirrors reflecting lamplight from within. Servants opened the doors quickly, word of the council's decision already traveling ahead of them. There had been no scandal, no reprimand, only affirmation. Yet as Elena stepped down onto the damp gravel, she did not carry triumph in her expression. She carried relief, quiet and restrained. Inside, the great hall felt warmer than usual, though the hearth burned no brighter than before. Adrian removed his gloves slowly, watching her as she handed the ledger back to the steward for safekeeping. The act seemed ceremonial in its simplicity. For 7 years, that ledger had symbolized silent effort. Now it symbolized something shared. The evening meal was prepared without extravagance, a deliberate return to routine rather than celebration. They dined at the smaller table near the east windows, the rain tracing thin lines against glass as candles flickered gently between them. For a time, neither spoke. The events of the day required no immediate analysis. Respect had been witnessed publicly, but something more private remained unspoken. I misjudged the cost of silence, Adrian said at last, his voice low, steady, no longer guarded. Elena lifted her gaze, surprised not by confession but by its directness. Silence protects nothing if it conceals truth, she replied softly. He considered that. Outside, rain softened the soil that would soon accept seed. Inside, words softened ground long left unturned. I believed authority required distance, he continued. I believed partnership would weaken perception. A faint, thoughtful smile touched her lips. Perception is strengthened by unity, she said, especially when it is genuine. He did not look away from her then. Candlelight reflected in her eyes, no longer distant gray but something warmer, almost luminous. For years he had mistaken composure for indifference. Now he saw discipline shaped by care rather than pride. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I intend to visit the eastern fields personally. I would value your assessment beside mine. The request carried no command, only invitation. Elena inclined her head gently. I will be ready at sunrise. Outside, the rain began to ease, leaving the night hushed and expectant. The estate had weathered winter. The council had affirmed leadership. Yet the most profound shift had occurred not in public chamber or harvested field, but across a candlelit table where 2 figures had chosen to speak without armor. Adrian felt the weight of former words echo faintly in memory, words spoken in pride that now seemed distant and hollow. He could not undo them, but he could choose differently moving forward. As the last drops of rain slipped from the eaves and darkness settled across the 50 acres, he realized that legacy was not merely land passed from one generation to the next. It was the courage to correct oneself before spring demanded new growth. And beside him, steady and unyielding, Elena Whitmore represented not obligation, but the partner he had finally begun to deserve. Sunrise arrived pale and deliberate, casting a soft gold sheen across the 50 acres where frost had finally retreated into shallow patches along the northern fence. True to his word, Adrian waited in the courtyard before dawn, boots already marked with damp earth rather than polished marble. When Elena descended the steps, wrapped in a tailored wool coat the color of early spring soil, he noticed the absence of hesitation in her stride. For the first time in years, they left Hawthorne Hall together, not for ceremony, not for obligation, but for purpose. The air carried the scent of wet ground and new beginnings as they walked beyond the stone path into the fields. Workers paused respectfully as the Marquis and Marchioness approached, their nods no longer divided between authority and quiet gratitude. Adrian listened as Elena explained the soil rotation she had proposed, pointing to narrow strips where thaw had revealed darker, richer layers beneath. "If we shift the planting pattern by 15 acres, she said calmly, we will preserve nutrients for autumn harvest rather than exhausting them by midsummer. He crouched to examine the earth she indicated, pressing his gloved hand into the softened surface. She was right. The ground yielded easily, promising growth where patience had been applied. For several minutes they walked in companionable silence, the vast land stretching around them like an open ledger waiting for careful entries. "You have known this estate in ways I did not," Adrian admitted quietly. Elena's gaze remained on the horizon. "I learned it because I had to," she replied. "When one feels unseen inside a house, one looks outward for purpose." The honesty in her words carried no bitterness, only reflection. He felt its weight nonetheless. "I do see you now," he said, the statement simple yet unguarded. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him with thoughtful steadiness, as though testing whether the ground beneath them was as stable as it appeared. "Seeing requires consistency," she said at last. "Not moments." The wind moved gently through thawing grass, lifting loose strands of her hair against her cheek. Adrian resisted the impulse to brush them aside, not from distance, but from respect. "I intend to prove consistency," he replied. "Not through proclamation. Through action." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the effort without surrendering caution. They continued across the fields, mapping irrigation adjustments and discussing delivery schedules for seed expected within the next 2 weeks. Partnership took shape in shared decisions rather than grand gestures. By late morning, sunlight warmed the land enough to release the faint scent of turned soil, a quiet promise that winter's hold had ended. As they returned toward Hawthorne Hall, its tall windows reflecting the brightness of day, Adrian realized that authority had once been his armor. Now it felt lighter, reshaped by trust. Beside him walked not a figure bound by title, but a woman whose strength had steadied 50 acres through storm and scrutiny alike. And in the measured cadence of their steps across open ground, the foundation of something lasting began to root itself deeper than pride ever could. 2 weeks later, the first true signs of spring began to press through the thawing 50 acres, thin green shoots cutting through soil that had endured months of frost. Hawthorne Hall stood bathed in early morning light, its tall windows reflecting a horizon no longer muted by winter gray. Inside the East Office, Elena reviewed the final contracts for seed delivery, her pen moving with quiet precision across parchment that carried both promise and responsibility. Adrian entered without announcement, though his presence no longer startled her. He paused beside the window, observing workers unloading the first wagon of grain in the courtyard below. The rhythm of labor felt different now, not urgent, purposeful. The estate was no longer reacting to crisis. It was preparing for growth. "There is something I intend to correct," Adrian said at last, his voice measured yet resolute. Elena set her pen down slowly, sensing the weight beneath his tone. He crossed the room, retrieving a small velvet case from the desk drawer where it had remained untouched for weeks. When he opened it, the bracelet she had sold during the storm rested inside, its delicate metal catching the morning sun. "I recovered it from the jeweler in town," he explained. "Not as repayment, but as acknowledgement." She regarded the bracelet, then him. "You were not required to do so," she said softly. He shook his head. "Requirement is no longer my measure. Respect is." The word lingered between them, steady and sincere. He extended the bracelet toward her, not insisting, not commanding. An offering rather than a correction. Elena hesitated only briefly before accepting it, fastening it around her wrist with calm deliberation. The gesture carried no extravagance, yet its meaning surpassed ornament. It was not the metal she valued. It was the intention behind its return. Outside, workers began marking 15 acres for the adjusted planting pattern she had proposed, thin stakes pressed into soil that promised harvest months from now. Adrian moved closer, his expression no longer guarded by pride. "I once believed legacy was preserved by distance," he said quietly. "I was mistaken. It is preserved by those willing to stand within it fully." Elena met his gaze, seeing not apology alone, but change anchored by action. "Growth requires tending," she replied gently, "even in hearts." A faint smile touched his features, unpracticed yet genuine. "Then let us tend this estate together," he answered, the words no longer hesitant. The sunlight brightened, illuminating the office in warm gold. For 7 years they had occupied the same space, divided by silence. Now silence felt less like separation and more like shared understanding. Beyond the windows, 50 acres stretched toward a horizon washed clean by rain and time. Within those acres lay effort, humility, and partnership. And as the first wagon of seed was carried across the courtyard stones, Adrian understood that correction, when offered with sincerity, does not diminish authority. It restores it. Beside him stood not obligation, nor ornament, but the woman whose quiet strength had redefined both land and heart. And in that steady morning light, something once spoken in pride was replaced by something stronger, spoken now without armor and without fear. Spring arrived not with spectacle, but with certainty. Across the 50 acres of Hawthorne land, green rows began to form in quiet alignment, seedlings pressing upward through dark soil that had once seemed unyielding. From the highest window of Hawthorne Hall, the estate no longer appeared burdened by winter. It looked alive. Inside the east office, sunlight streamed across polished floors and the long oak table where partnership had first taken root. Elena stood near the window, her bracelet catching the light in subtle flashes as she observed workers marking the final irrigation lines. The air carried the scent of earth and promise. Adrian entered without hesitation, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm. There were no ledgers between them now, no counsel to impress, no rumor to silence, only the steady hum of life beyond stone walls. "I walked the southern boundary at dawn," he said quietly. "The soil is stronger there than it has been in years." Elena turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Preparation makes resilience possible," she replied. He studied her, not as ruler assessing responsibility, but as a man recognizing the strength that had always stood beside him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he crossed the room, stopping within arm's reach. "I once believed marriage was obligation secured by contract," he said. "I spoke from pride and from fear of losing control." The admission carried no flourish, only truth. Elena held his gaze steadily, allowing him to continue. "I was wrong," he added. "Not because I lacked authority, but because I lacked understanding. You were my true wife long before I learned how to be your true husband." Silence followed, not empty, but full. The words did not erase what had been spoken in colder seasons, yet they reshaped what would follow. Elena's expression softened, not with triumph, but with recognition of growth honestly earned. "Growth requires tending," she reminded him gently. "And humility." He nodded once. "Then let us continue tending it, together." Outside, workers paused briefly as the first wagon of additional seed crossed the courtyard, its wooden wheels steady against stone. The estate moved forward not through decree, but through shared effort. Adrian extended his hand, not in command, not in display, but in invitation. Elena placed her hand in his without hesitation. The gesture was simple, intentional, equal. Beyond the tall windows, 50 acres stretched beneath a sky clear of storm, each row of seedlings a testament to preparation and patience. Hawthorne Hall stood unchanged in stone, yet entirely altered in spirit. Where distance once echoed, partnership now resided. Where pride once dictated silence, respect now shaped words. And as the sunlight warmed both land and heart alike, the legacy they carried ceased to be his alone. It became theirs, rooted not merely in title, but in the courage to choose one another when it mattered most.